First, the context of early Armenian genocide scholarship. The early scholarship on the Armenian genocide is to be found in the writings of Sebu Agumi, Haygazan Razarian, and Father Krikor Gergerian, who wrote under the pseudonym Krieger. Their essential works, based on various archival sources, mark the early stage of Armenian genocide studies. Agumi's volume, in Armenian, based on the documents collected by the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul from 1918 to 1920, provides the first scholarly outline of the genocidal process, the deportations, and the genocide itself, including to a certain extent at the provincial level. Published in 1921, this work probably remained the most valuable monograph on the Armenian genocide until perhaps the late 1980s. Haygazan Razarian touched upon many of the archives and lines of inquiry later analyzed by Vahakan Dadrian. He explored the post-war trial records of the Committee of Union and Progress, published in the official Ottoman Gazette, Takvimi Vekai, and the decision-making. He also paved the way to the use of German diplomatic archives. Finally, Father Gergerian used the Ottoman documents of the post-war court-martials to document the extermination of the Armenians in the region of Yozgat. His book sheds light on many aspects of the genocide, including the nature of the special organization that was mainly in charge of its implementation. In addition, he was also the first scholar to assess the validity of the Ottoman documents first published by Aram Andonian in 1921. Beyond these pioneering works, a handful of other publications marked the transition of Armenian genocide studies towards academic standards of inquiry. France was the country where this process started in the 1970s with the publication of two significant volumes, at least by the standards prevailing then. I still remember Jean-Marie Carzou's Arménie 1915, Un génocide exemplaire. This was the first book that I read on the Armenian genocide. The few pages devoted to that event emphasize the responsibility of the three main Turkish Ottoman leaders, Talat, Enver, and Cemal Pashas, and of German imperialism and its economic interests. In 1957, 2 years after the publication of his essay, its content was included with minor modification in a textbook for middle schools. The first academic-length publications dealing with the genocide appeared in 1994, so far as I can tell, by Yervan Sarkisyan, Magerdich Nersisyan, and Professor Rupel Sahakian. They were path-breaking in the Soviet context. They tended to emphasize the continuity of Ottoman anti-Armenian policies from the end of the 19th century onward, and to argue that the decision to carry out the genocide was made before World War I. Since then, Armenian genocide studies in late Soviet and post-Soviet Armenia have lagged behind the development in the West from the mid-1980s to the present. The latest textbook for university students, published in 2012, makes the following statements about the genocide. Sultan Abdulhamid II was the first to start the Armenian genocide, and the Young Turks followed suit. The later's decision to carry out the genocide, given the right opportunity to do so, was taken at the meeting of the Committee of Union and Progress in Salonika in 1997. And final key point, Germany encouraged Turkey in its genocidal actions. Overall, there is little evidence of a conversation between what is being published in Armenia and what is being published in the West, and that is of course, a problem. Naturally, to be fair, one would have to emphasize the dismal conditions prevailing in academia and post-Soviet Armenia, the salaries, the difficulties of traveling, access to archives, and one should keep all that also in mind. Another problem is languages, in particular English and French and German. The bottom line is this: the in-depth empirical study of the Armenian genocide by academics is a relatively recent phenomenon, and one could point possibly to Vahakan's, Dadrian's, the Naim Amdonian documents on the World War I destruction of Ottoman Armenians, the anatomy of a genocide, as having ushered in this new stage of scholarly inquiry in 1986. There were fewer than 3 or 4 Western scholars with an academic position involved in part or as a whole in the field of Armenian genocide studies. The mood was particular, I remember it vividly. Turkish state-sponsored denial, its quasi-support by the foreign policy community, and the acquiescence of part of the media establishment to denial had created a particular mood, especially in the United States, in which the early academic scholarship on the genocide was developed. Applied to Armenian genocide studies, a kind of basic sociology of knowledge shows that the few scholars touching upon that topic were hired in the early 1960s, prior to the revival of the genocide issue in the mid-70s, and the consequent state-sponsored denial. Publications were very limited. A dominant school of historiography became at that time the so-called world system theory, where non-Muslims were reduced to merchants, essentially, without any substantial research, portrayed as internal enemies, and Armenians had, in particular, and not just Armenians, Muslim groups, had disappeared from the narrative of Ottoman history, which was being rewritten from the perspective of the modern Turkish state to a substantial extent. In those years, it was panels at various places, usually organized by Richard Hovannessian with his students, that kept the issue alive. And naturally, the early scholarship on the Armenian genocide, I'm thinking, of course, of Professor Dadrian, tended to be reactive in nature and somewhat prosecutorial in its it needed to prove that genocide had occurred, that genocidal intent was clear, that the Armenian genocide was relevant in current international law, and so on. There was also a phenomenon which I call document fetishism. Such and such a document in the British archives proves that, you know, there was 10 commandments, there were 10 commandments, and they defined the Armenian genocide, and we have the absolute proof that it was planned, and so on. This was the mood which was understandable in the context in which this early scholarship was produced. On the Professor Dadrian led the foundation for Armenian genocide studies, which is extremely unusual in most fields for any single individual. His quasi-monopolistic access to 2 archival collections, those of the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul, housed in Jerusalem, and Father Krikor Grigoryan's archives in New York, contributed to the depth of his work. It also shed light, this access to those archives sheds light on his term in the mid-1980s, for until then he had only published short theoretical articles about genocide. The disintegration of Yugoslavia, 1990-95, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 91, with their consequent cases of ethnic cleansing and ethno-territorial disputes, as well as the Rwanda genocide in '94, brought about a growing academic interest in issues related to mass murder and violence, mostly outside the field of Middle East studies. It is in this context that the Armenian genocide attracted the attention of numerous scholars who were striving to better understand this phenomenon. Norman Neymark, Michael Mann, Benjamin Valentino, John Lee, Jacques Semelin in France, and many others started dealing with issues of ethnic cleansing, genocide, mass killing, and so on. Professor Ronald Suni and Müge Göcek's workshops on Armenian Turkish scholarships, which started in 2000, captured this moment and broadened both the circle of scholars dealing with genocide and of our understanding of it. To a significant extent, the workshops turned the Armenian genocide into a mainstream topic and made denial questionable in higher academia at least. To a great extent, I would attribute the emergence of Armenian genocide as a field, that is, with a network group of diverse scholars engaged in active debates, to these workshops. The current knowledge and the archives. Well, the progress that has been made since the late 1990s is outright remarkable. I will be very brief, and some of the latest publications I haven't read yet, so you'll excuse me if I don't mention them, but in due time to this essay. Based on the research of a few scholars, Vahakan Dadrian, Raymond Kevorkian, we now have an overall view of the genocide and detailed knowledge about some of its specific aspects. Taner Akçam's recent book, based on Ottoman archival documents, sheds valuable lights on the mechanics of the Armenian genocide and the motivations of those who carried it out. Thanks to this scholar, we know about the main actors as well as the main organizations, the special organization, the Directorate for the Settlement of Tribes and Refugees that were involved in the commission of these mass murders. Dadrian and Akçam have translated the verdicts of the post-World War I Ottoman military tribunals that court-martialed the main Young Turk leaders involved in the genocide and have analyzed in depth their crucially informative proceedings. The timing of what could well be the final decision to carry out the genocide has been narrowed down to end February to end March 1915. Kevorkian's latest book, along with some works by Yves Ternon and Unger, has brought our knowledge of the genocide down to the regional level, which was a much overdue development. Kevorkian has also thoroughly documented for the first time the death camps of Syria and Mesopotamia, and there is a dissertation underway at Clark University that looks quite promising. Donald Bloxham has fully integrated the games played by European powers in the course of the Armenian genocide, and concerning these powers, Germany's policies toward the Armenian Ottomans and role in the Armenian genocide that have drawn the most scholarly attention lately. At this point, it can be stated that the thesis of German state complicity advanced by Professor Dadrian might need further corroboration. I will jump over many of these achievements and will not mention people who have contributed enormously, like Hans Lukas Kieser, Fuat Dündar, and others for the sake of time. I would like, third point, to make a few comments about the archives, and in particular the Armenian archives, the archives of the Patriarchate of Istanbul, it is quasi-impossible to use them, except if you go to Paris to the Noubal Library and you have about 2 years of your life that you can spend there without being paid. Then it's a magnificent possibility to work there. The archives of Father Gregorian, who collected sources, remarkable sources, over decades. 64 rolls of microfilm and another roll that hasn't been given to the so-called Armenian National Institute located in Washington. I took those sources, they are remarkable. You can find most of the documents that Adrian has used, German archives, newspapers, La Renaissance, and so on. Gentlemen collected them all. Okay? I tried to get a copy of those rolls a few years ago. I was faced with all kinds of stories. I found the uncle of Father Gregorian to check whether what I was being told was true, and naturally it was a lie. Father Gregorian had allowed copies to be made for the sake of distribution to relevant people working in the field, and we have, in a nutshell, with Armenian archives, you are aware of the problems with the Ottoman archives, especially the military ones that are inaccessible. The Prime Ministry archives, Başbakanlık, I am told, is much more open now. The extent to being cleansed is another matter. A few words about insufficiently researched topics. I will go very quickly because I have 3.5 minutes left. First, bringing society back in. The Armenian genocide seems to occur in a societal void. Issues of daily interaction, Muslim-Armenian interaction, economic life, the craftsmen, and so on. These are very important topics, and it is also very important to be able to define the complexity of Ottoman life. Very clearly, life in Istanbul was not similar to Bekir or in Adana, and we need to map out all that complexity. In addition to this topic, Armenians up to now are not fully agents of history. What role did they play in the Reform Act of 1940? What were the positions of the Patriarchate of Istanbul in 1896, 1908, 1912? Did they correspond to those of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation or not? In a nutshell, the positions of Armenian institutions has not been documented appropriately to this point. Finally, the role of in the Armenian genocide, the Ottoman military, I believe, needs much more research. And final point, the issue of continuity or discontinuity between the Hamidian and Committee of Union and Progress periods deserves more attention. There is no need to mention the culture and routinization of state-sponsored violence against Armenian Ottomans, but having read some of the memoranda and memoirs of Sultan Abdulhamid, one can already discern some of the themes that appear under the Young Turks. That is a kind of early economic resentment, early Turkish nationalism, and so on. You can find some threads there. Conclusion. We are witnessing the normalization of this field. It is no more merely an Armenian field based on the exceptional energy of a couple of iconic European, American, and Turkish Ottomanists or Europeanists are now in the conversation. Political scientists, sociologists, psychologists are involved in it in one way or another. And the genocide is increasingly part of studies of World War I. The change compared with the late 70s and 80s is outright impressive. In view of all that we do not know, as crucial massive archival funds are inaccessible, for various reasons, have been used only by a few scholars, or have not been explored at all, caution is required regarding broad arguments about various issues such as ideology or Islam in determining the genocide. Even though what I call the academic production have changed drastically since the 1980s, denial continues. Indeed, denial is political in its nature, and it will continue. These days, it has a more subtle form. There are people who try to get scholars involved in various conferences or even commissions. On the whole, I think it's a bad idea to mix politics with history. The main point of this essay can be summed up by referring to one of Winston Churchill's famous speeches. Now, this is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Armenian genocide studies have precisely reached the end of their first phase of solid academic production. Much has been achieved, but we still know relatively little. Thank you.